I think I did it. I have just created a mathematical model showing that it is nearly impossible for Black Americans to have nearly 70% African admixture. Because population genetics and history are considered two separate disciplines in academia, none of the estimations actually look at the population counts in colonial America to see if it's even possible that the African slave population could have contributed that much African ancestry to its descendants. So I wanted to know, how would this change if we actually use data that was grounded in historical primary sources and official record? I constructed estimates using US Census counts, tax rolls, databases like slave voyages, and I came up with some estimates about how many African-born slaves were brought into what would become the United States between the years 1620, so not too long after the first colonists arrived, all the way until 1808, when African slave importation was banned in the United States. Then I decided to calculate pairing probabilities, which is essentially looking at how many people of each group, African enslaved, non-African enslaved, and European colonists in the total population have a probability of pairing or partnering with each other. As you can see, because of the total population, African-only pairings are pretty low. The highest probability for both African and non-African slaves was pairing with a European colonist. Obviously, this is true because of just sheer population numbers, but we also know from the historical record that European colonists had the access and the legal right to dictate who slaves partnered and paired with. So then I was like, okay, even if we accept that there was a lot of pairing between colonists and slaves, I know people are gonna say, well, they didn't do that. They actually just had slaves partner with each other because of geographic location, because of social status, whatnot. Okay, that's fine. So I applied a clustering coefficient and I used the strongest weight that I possibly could before it mathematically broke. Then using standard inheritance formulas, I calculated the percentage of African ancestry that the child would have based on the different pairing probabilities. This is the key piece here. All of his population was happening over time. So that means that the percentage of pure African ancestry was going to be diluted every generation, even with more people coming in, because the folks that are, once they're being imported or once they're immigrating, they're going to be mixing with the general population of slaves or otherwise. So after weighting, accounting for the clustering, the probability of each different pairing is right there. Notice that African with African, which is the only combination that would produce 100% African ancestry, only has 0.2% of happening in colonial America. When you put all that together, by the end of that early period in 1684, you're looking at less than 1% of African ancestry in the total population. So why so low? The key point is down there. African-born slaves were only 2% of the population. So they can't contribute a huge amount of ancestry when they're like literally the smallest minority group in the entire population. So then I repeated this process, carrying over the percentage of African ancestry in the population from the early period and moving that into the middle period and then later on the late period. And I just did the same process over and over again with the same assumptions based on the estimated population numbers. So by the end of the middle period, which was 1685 to about 1747, we have an estimated, there it is, about 4.19% African ancestry in the population, which was a significant increase. But again, Africans are still only 9.6% of the total population. By the time we get to 1808, with the largest waves of imported African-born slaves, we end with the ban on importation at about 5.2% African ancestry in the colonial United States. So that means at no point from 1620 to 1808 were Africans ever more than 10% of the total population. And even when their numbers increase, it's not like they're all going to one place at one time. So if you say, well, 300,000 slaves came in between 1748 and 1808, you're right, but that's a period of over 80 years. And not all slaves were going to one location. They were spread throughout the colonies. So then you take this scenario all the way into 2025. We have the end of slavery in the Americas, and we have lots of booms in immigration from other groups, but we don't have any more large scale mass immigration of continental Africans into the United States. So then I used the US Census numbers from 2020 as my new population estimates, and I came up with the group other to signify all the other ethnicities and including some Africans that are now entering into the United States. Black Americans are going to be considered my enslaved group, since that is the group in the United States that is recognized to be the direct descendants of enslaved people. So carrying forward the ancestry that was at the end of 1808, which was 5.2%, using the same process that I've done before, adding in clustering, weighting the averages, looking at total populations, the current African ancestry that would be present in the United States is about 4.6%. If a founder population never reaches more than 10% of the total population, they aren't socially and geographically isolated, there are no large-scale immigration events, and their immigration was more like a pipeline over 200 years, then there is no way that their ancestry could dominate their descendants' ancestry 200 years after that.